5 nerds in a basement somewhere. It's like, they had no impact. And so there's kind of a question, I think, of whether or not video games is the right term for what I'm interested in, what I want to talk about. And basically, yeah, it is. Like, I don't think there's a whole lot of room for pedantry about these kind of things. For the rest of the talk, I'm going to say computer games, but it's only because it matches up with a really simple definition, which is a computer game is a computer program that plays a game. And that's simple enough and useful enough for me for now. These programs can be competitive, they can be games of chance, they can let you assume another personality, depending on who you are. There are occasionally games of vertigo, because you can't handle like the FPS bobbing. They can be like joyful, they can be challenging, they can be exhilarating, they can be compulsive. They have all of these qualities of games. So obviously computer games are games. The thing is though, they can't really do it in a void. The same way Kyo says that games have to be social, computer games have this kind of dire need to communicate information about the game to external players. Otherwise, they're kind of largely theoretical and just not interesting for what I want to talk about. So this is the definition that I'm going to use and the term I'm going to use for the rest of the talk, whether it's a good idea or not. So the thing I like about it is it relies on play as Harzinga defines it, game the way Kyo defines it. It's broad enough to include a lot of stuff, but it excludes things like pinball machines, which I freaking love, and I think they're really, really interesting, but they're maybe not part of what we consider as computer games for the purposes of this talk, at least. So the reason that I want to even come up with a definition like this, come up with an idea or a term and define computer games for you guys and draw lines in the sand, etc., is right away, as soon as you say, well, what's a computer game? It's a computer and a game. You immediately need to talk about how the game communicates with the people or machines or whatever that are playing it. And I think this is really telling, and it kind of betrays the other side of games. There's this history of play, or prehistory of play even. There's this history of games, but computer games have this whole other bloodline, right? Which is a lot of game creators have been really interested in emulating books and movies basically forever. So Metroid was maybe the first high-profile game to blatantly mimic Alien. It had a strong brunette heroine, who was later changed to blonde, but screw that. And a boss character named Ridley. Like, Ridley Scott directed Alien, and they just named a monster after the director. Like, it's very much there. And this is kind of a tradition that's lived on in, games that have just copied other movies in the Alien franchise. And I totally get this, and I do this, right? Like, my last popular game is just like District 9 and District B13, like mashed unceremoniously together. So I do this, and I totally understand it, and I love it. But it's kind of a good idea and a bad idea. And I'm going to kind of bring this back around to Scott McCloud again, who wrote this awesome book called Understanding Comics, which is maybe like the most inspiring thing you'll ever read about video games, oddly. But he specifically points out how easy and natural it is for especially new creators to just copy the surface qualities of another artist or art form, right? And this makes, again, tons of sense. It's the first thing you see, you're like, oh my god, that Space Marine looks awesome. I'm drawing Space Marines in my notebook for like the next 10 years. It's something that we just do, but the problem is that just copying the surface tends to yield a pretty disappointing result. Because the thing that you admire, the thing when you sit down and play the Space Marine game, the thing that you like isn't just the Space Marine, it's everything under it. It's all this other stuff. And if you're copying the surface, you're not copying that stuff. So there's a lot of inspiration to be drawn from the world of comics, I think, even more than just books. I think it's fairly easy to see books as kind of like a weird subset of comics even. It's true. Books have been around for like 1,000 years, 2,000 years, maybe. Comics have been around for like 30,000. So it's really easy to focus on these superficial things like story types or character designs or rendering styles, especially if you're like looking at Panzer Dragoon art by Jean Giraud. But these things just aren't worth that much when they're taken out of context. These are just these surface qualities. So even though lately it seems like comics, only tell this kind of story, for thousands of years, comics have used every conceivable style of presentation encompassing the full breadth of pictorial images and written words to tell every conceivable kind of story. So sometimes in computer games, it seems like we only tell this kind of story, like Rob Liefeld with computer games, or this kind of story. These are two totally separate games. Literally, like one takes place like 200 years in the future. We can actually tell a lot of different stories, and we can tell them in a lot of different styles, and they can be about a lot of different things. So I think, game creators may sometimes be inspired by comics. I think it's something that we can look to in the future as a source of piles of interesting things, especially because we need to communicate to players, and visuals are one way that we do that. I think a lot of us are inspired by movies, just like the guys that built Metroid, just like the guys that built Halo. And some games try this more literally than others, but I think whether we admit it or not, no matter like how far we are personally out on the cutting edge of making obscure games where you're dead the whole time, we will still use cinematic as praise for a game. And I don't think it's really coincidental. And we're specifically praising their movie-like quality. But we know that these things are just surface qualities. We're saying, oh, there's a sweet action scene where like the camera's shaking, and this guy says this like snarky one-liner and like shoots this other guy, and it's this, top level of cinema that we're kind of scraping off. So this is going to be a way out of tangent, but I think it's super interesting, and it's very hypothetical. But the first moving picture was shot in 1877 as part of a science experiment. Stop me if this sounds familiar. And there's an attempt to, the science experiment is there's horses, right? Everybody knows what horses are. And they didn't know if when horses ran, if all their feet were off the ground at once. So they invented movies to figure out if horses' feet were all off the ground at one time. And this did nothing for decades. Like, they would show it at like symposia and be like, look at our fine horse photos, and like, that was all it was. So like 30 years later, like this is the state of cinema essentially. Like, it's obviously very dynamic and exciting. It's just like a guy standing there with a gun. So it's pretty primitive, and a lot of your film going experience is not going to theaters, or like they were called Nickelodeons at the time. Your movie going experience would be like you're like drunk after getting off of your insane factory job, and you go see strippers, and after the strippers go, the guys who haven't fallen asleep or been dragged out of the strip club go behind where the stripper was and watch like a short movie. Like that's where that's the cultural space they occupied like 30 years after they were invented. So there's this idea that movies telling an artistic, articulated narrative was completely discounted on a broad cultural basis. So in 1925, which is 50 years after they did their horse experiment, this guy, who kind of looks like this guy, pioneered something that has become like a really big deal in cinema, and he called it montage. And montage works like this. You present a couple of apparently unrelated images, and the viewer fills in the blanks about kind of what's going on. I'm simplifying here, but like full Soviet montage theory is, again, like way outside the scope of this talk. So if I show you this image of a frightened woman, and then show you this image of a baby carriage careening out of control down a stone staircase, it's really hard not to link them together, and you think either the woman is seeing this happen, or she's part of some kind of disastrous thing that's happening. But there's a little abstraction. It's not clear if she's the mother or if she's just a mother who's appalled at what's happening or a concerned citizen. But you have a basic concept that they're related, and just because they're next to each other, it's like that and that. You're like, oh, whoa, there's a story. And it's not, it's like two pictures. There's barely anything happening there. So the thing I think is interesting is this is what makes comics work too. And this process is what Scott McCloud calls closure, which is looking at one thing and looking at another and kind of using your imagination to fill in everything that happens in between. So comics have been around for like 15,000 years. Moving pictures have been around for about 50 years. And this guy invents a weird technique that changes movies forever. And like, basically the point is that film and games share a whole lot of common ground. On the surface and beneath the surface. Children of Men is a movie that looks a lot like a video game to me, but it has a lot of other stuff going on. But you know, games and movies are young media. They're heavily shaped by commerce and technology. They struggle to differentiate themselves from existing media and find their own language. They're maligned by critics as incapable of profundity or significance. But it's like 3 years after like Soviet montage theory starts to be taken seriously. Most people agree that in the right hands, cinema is capable of a lot. And it just takes a while to kind of find the right way to say it, or to find the right language. So there's a bunch of stuff in cinematic language that's actually really useful for games. Using a low camera angle to help communicate the scope or scale of objects in the world. Or the way that you can use sound to kind of fill in a world outside the visual frame with a little more detail than a picture can actually hold. So it's hard for me to stress how important soundscape is in games. And again, this is like way outside the scope of this talk, like everything else. But like 2/3 maybe of what the player experiences in your game is going to come through sound. Like it's almost hard to say for sure if this is even a picture of a beach. But with the noise, you know it is. And you know there are birds flying around, even though there's no emotion. So what I'm trying to get at is that the medium of computer games, to me, is this incredible awe-inspiring thing. It's this pre-human force of play combined with the entire history of art in all its myriad forms. So the creation of art, regardless of the medium, is almost always a playful act. And as an audience, we engage with art in a playful way. Whether we're sympathizing with a tragic character in a book or a movie, or we're moved by a beautiful piece of music, or we're playing a beautiful piece of music, art and play have been really intimately connected almost forever. So what makes video games so special if that's all they're doing? And I think it's the fact that games demand the player to improvise, that they're uncertain, that the outcome is not predetermined, combined, and that's just games, not computer games even. But if you combine that with the way computer games can incorporate so many other art forms, I think it makes something kind of special and unique in the human experience. So, to roughly sum up, you have this idea that computer games combine play and tension with art to create a whole new medium. The problem, if there's a problem, is that I think possibly the language that we use to communicate through this medium is a little bit primitive, and I think that's where you come in. And what I want to say is that I believe that one little idea can catapult a fledgling art form out of the cultural ghetto and into the core of human civilization forever. And that's about all I have. In closing, I want to try and emphasize that the unique place that computer games occupy in our history is like, it's good to have a sense of perspective. So like, civilization is age, and there's a bunch of studies, Coyote and Harthinger will talk about sort of the rise and fall of the Roman Empire and the part that play played in that, but play is displaced by work generally as civilizations grow older. And society has a tendency to corrupt games that help create it in the first place. Sports evolves into violence, lotteries, and the compulsion to participate turn into superstition. You think that you can control the lottery or that you're going to guess the right numbers. The need to play another role in theater turns into schizophrenia, and not medically speaking, but there's a good chance that this century, right now, the last 100 years, are like the least playful 100 years in human history. And it's in the middle of this century of fear and irony and work that computer games appear. And it's kind of an amazing coincidence, I think, that after millennia of human development and centuries of scientific and technological progress, the same forces that have been calling play from civilization in our day-to-day lives have also resulted in the first, like, pure marriage of games and art. By participating in the development of computer games, we can't help but change the world. And changing the world changes the way we play, and changing the way we play changes the world. We can create original works of art that demand audience participation.